To gain a better understanding of Jesus Christ, we need to look at the historical context of first century Palestine. And Palestine is the land of Israel. We need to understand the cultural and historical background. Today, we're going to look at the religion of Judaism in the first century. And by the end of this presentation, we'll understand, hopefully, that Judaism was not a united whole, it was divided, that there are several different groups of Jews with their own beliefs. I would like to also credit Felix Jesuit, for the content of this presentation. Here's a brief history of Judaism from the monarchy in 1000 BCE, basically King David, all the way to the Roman occupation of Palestine. What's important here is that the Romans occupied Israel in 63 BCE, so that when Jesus, who was Jewish, was born, he was born into this time period of Roman occupation. This Roman occupation is pretty much the background of the gospel stories. Now, if you take a look, the destruction of the temple on 70 CE, this is a very important and tragic event in Jewish history. The Jews and Romans went to war in 66 CE, and the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. This is a point I will return to at the end of the presentation. So, were the Jews united in the first century? No, they were not. They were pretty divided. And here are the 5 basic Jewish groups that we're going to talk about today. First are the Sadducees, second the Essenes, Zealot Sicarii, I grouped them into one, the Pharisees, and this group that we'll call the Nazarenes. So obviously these 5 groups, there are a lot more Jewish groups in the first century, but for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to concentrate on those 5. This is the first group, the Pharisees. This slide is pretty detailed, but I think what's important to know is that their name, Pharisee, means separated ones, which in a sense means holy ones. They were strict followers of the law of Moses and the Jewish tradition, but aside from believing in the written Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, they also believed in the oral Torah, laws and statutes of Moses that were passed down by word of mouth. They also believed in the resurrection, life after death, angels and demons. And what's interesting is that Jesus himself was very Pharisaic. He was very much like a Pharisee, and some scholars argued that his discussions and arguments with the Pharisees suggest that he was included with this group of Pharisees, that he was probably a Pharisee himself. So that the Pharisees, they would engage in arguments with each other in hopes to find truth. And basically Jesus, as a Pharisee, he would have done this. But, that's scholarly debate. So, furthermore, Jesus' views on loving one's neighbor parallels the beliefs of some of the Pharisees. So, maybe Jesus was a Pharisee, maybe he wasn't. And also, something to note is that Paul, who's the author of most of the epistles in the New Testament, was also a Pharisee. The next Jewish group is the Sadducees. I think the best way to understand the Sadducees is that they were the rivals and the opposites of the Pharisees now. For one, they did believe in the written Torah, so they believe in the 5 books of Moses, but they didn't believe in the oral Torah. They didn't believe in any other tradition aside from the written Torah. Furthermore, they didn't believe in the resurrection, meaning the general resurrection, that everyone would be resurrected at the end of time. They didn't believe in life after death. They didn't believe in angels and demons. And this group was primarily chief priests, closely associated with the ruling council of the Jews, the Sanhedrin. And if you remember in the gospel narratives, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, are the ones who arrest Jesus and put him to trial. And basically other Jewish groups didn't like the Sadducees because they collaborated with the Romans. And who are the priests? Well, basically they're the ones that offered sacrifices at the temple. In first century Palestine, the Jews and the Romans didn't like each other. The Romans occupied the land of Israel and the Jews wanted them out. The Zealots and the Sicarii were rebellious Jews who hated the Romans and would pretty much stab every Roman soldier they saw. Eventually there would be a war between the Jews and Rome about 30 years after the death of Jesus. And what's particularly interesting is that crucifixion, the death of Jesus, was a Roman form of capital punishment reserved for criminals against Rome, punishment for revolutionaries or rebels. The next group are the Essenes, basically a group of Jews found near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, This group separated themselves from everyone because they felt the Jewish temple of God was tainted because of the priests' collaboration with the Romans. So they separated themselves and waited for the coming of two messiahs. One messiah like the priest Aaron, and the other messiah like King David. So they waited for two messiahs. Now, scholars debate whether the scenes really existed or if they were the community in Qumran, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll assume that this community in Qumran were Essenes. Lastly, are the Nazarenes. This group of Jews, they followed a traveling preacher, an itinerant preacher named Jesus of Nazareth, hence their name Nazarenes. They referred to each other as brothers and sisters, and the Nazarenes, they didn't consider themselves a new religion, but that the expectation of the Messiah, that is the Savior of Israel, has been fulfilled through this person named Jesus of Nazareth. As I mentioned, the destruction of the temple was a very important and tragic event in Jewish history. The Romans and Jews would go into war in 66 CE, but the Jews would eventually lose to the Romans, and their temple would be destroyed in 70 CE. There are 5 main groups of Judaism in the first century. Once the Jews and Romans got into war, a lot of these groups disappeared. So without a Jewish temple, there were no sacrifices and no priests. There were no need for priests since there are no sacrifices without a temple. Hence the Sadducees were gone. The Romans eventually would win this war against the Jews, so the Zealots and Zachari were defeated. Today, archaeology has discovered the remains of a community in Qumran along the Dead Sea, which means the Essenes were gone. But Judaism did survive through these two Jewish groups that are left before you, the Pharisees and the Nazarenes. And these groups would later become known as Rabbinical Judaism and Christianity. And these two Jewish groups find their roots in biblical Judaism. And you could kind of say in the sense that Rabbinical Judaism and Christianity as we have them today are pretty much brothers and sisters from the same mother, that is, biblical Judaism.